Hi, I'm Lehman, and I'm going to do a brief demonstration here of a horary related to real estate, which is one of the topics that we will be covering in our Kepler College Horary course. So this is just an example, a situation that happened for me a couple of years ago. The question of the horary was, should I raise the price? Now, the story behind this is that the querent was one of the sellers of the property. And so they wanted to change the price, and they decided rather than lowering it, maybe they should raise it. This may at first seem like a really counterintuitive idea, but I had learned some years ago from a real estate agent who was pretty successful that sometimes it wasn't really that you had to keep lowering the price when you're selling it. Sometimes you just needed to change it, because oftentimes what this means is that in the listings, every time there's any change in the price of the property, it shows up on everybody's short list of properties that have had action. And so that sometimes provokes other real estate agents to pay more attention to this house. So that was the question: should we raise the price? In a horary question, the person who asked the question is called the querent, and they are represented by the first house. Here you see that person represented by Jupiter, the ruler of Sagittarius, and Jupiter's in the second house. Makes perfect sense for a horary, because what should a seller be concentrating on? The price of the property, right? So that part seems pretty clear. So then we can look at what's called the quesitant. The quesitant is who or what is being asked about. And so if you're talking about a sales transaction, which of course a house sale is, if the first house is the seller, then the seventh house is the buyer. If the buyer is the first house, and the seventh house is the seller. So here we have Gemini on the cusp of the seventh, and so that's Mercury. And that means that Mercury, being pretty strongly represented by domicile rulership here, suggests that the buyer is probably the one with more money than the seller, because Mercury is more highly dignified here than Jupiter is. That did ultimately prove to be the case, but it wasn't necessarily that clear right at this point. Now, in a real estate or any other kind of buy-sell horary, the 10th house gives the price of the property. So here you see that it's Libra that's on the cusp of the 10th, and we see that the part of fortune is there. Now, part of fortune is actually material fortune, so that works well enough. And so on both cases here, what we want to look at is Venus. Venus is in Taurus, so she's in domicile, so that's a pretty strong argument of a high price. So already this is looking like maybe raising the price is a good idea. Now, we're going to have to figure out a reason for Mars to be in the seventh house, but we're not going to cover that quite yet, but we will when I give you the explanation of what happened here. Now, I mentioned from the seller standpoint that the position of Jupiter ruling the seller in the second house is showing the seller is going about what a seller should go about. But this is actually a rather complicated second house. You can see Saturn's there, but Saturn is in domicile, so it's a more behaved Saturn. Jupiter is there. Jupiter is representing the querent. And we see the moon. Now, the moon in a house tends to suggest flux, in other words, change related to whatever that matter is. And here it would be some kind of financial change. This, again, suggests a change in price, not necessarily up or not necessarily down. But the part of fortune is read principally through its dispositors, and here that's Venus, and Venus is in good condition. And we also see the 10th house as represented by Venus, again in good condition. Strong argument that raising the price might be a good idea. Now, just parenthetically, notice Pluto right at the second house cusp. There's this idea in classical astrology, not just horary, but all astrologies, where planets that are up to 5 degrees past a house cusp are still called back to the previous house. So here, looking at regular daily motion, Pluto has just moved out of the second house and into the first house. Because it's within 5 degrees, it moves back. And so the Pluto indicates that there may be some large transaction going on there, but doesn't necessarily argue whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. Here, because of the strength of the 10th house ruler, we presume that it's a good thing, because this suggests the money to actually have a higher price. And here are Mercury and Gemini representing the buyers, suggest that there's room here for there to be a higher price. So that seemed fairly simple, but there's still the mystery of the Mars in the second house. So what happened was the sellers decided to raise the price. And I said, I don't know what that Mars is going to do, but there's something going on here. What turned out to happen was this. A buyer showed up. In fact, a buyer showed up flying into the city where this house was. So this was not just a casual, I'm living in the same town and curious about the houses that are in my area that are for sale. This is somebody committed. So this buyer came in and was very firm about what she wanted to pay. Shortly thereafter, think Gemini, think mutable signs, think double-bodied signs, a second buyer comes along. And so these people had not one, but two buyers to deal with. So what happens? A price war. And so there's our Mars. So as it turned out, it was the second buyer who was successful. And so the seller had as I recall, about a 20% increase in the property came as a result of the price war. So that's a good illustration here of where the counterintuitive idea was actually supported by the astrology. And so the sellers were prepared for the idea of making more money than they planned.